I'm 30-year-old, and I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. I've been married to Dean for 4 years now. We've had our ups and downs like any couple, but I really believed we were building something together. I was so wrong about that. What happened to me 3 months ago still makes my blood boil, but it also taught me just how strong I could be when everything was on the line. That morning started like any other. I was 30 minus 9 weeks pregnant, huge and uncomfortable, but excited. Dean had left early for a meeting in Phoenix with some real estate client. I wasn't thrilled about him traveling so close to my due date, but he promised he'd be back before evening. I should have trusted my instincts about that trip. Around 10 in the morning, I woke up with sharp cramps. At first, I thought it was just more Braxton Hicks contractions, but when I stood up, there was this warm gush that hit the floor. My water had broken, and Dean was 2 hours away. The pain hit me like a freight train, hard and fast. I could barely think straight, let alone walk to the phone. I called 911, and the dispatcher stayed on the line with me. I kept begging them to call my husband to make sure he knew what was happening. They said they'd try to reach him. The ambulance arrived within minutes. I remember a paramedic putting an oxygen mask over my face. I remember squeezing someone's hand in, crying through the contractions. Then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying in a hospital bed with thick bandages covering my belly. I'd had an emergency C- section, but I was completely alone. No one was in the room, no baby crying, no husband holding my hand. Something was very wrong. I started calling out for help, and when a nurse finally came in, I asked her the only question that mattered: where was my baby? She hesitated, which immediately put me on edge. She said he was in another wing for observation, and that my husband had requested he be kept there. I asked why, and she mumbled something about safety protocols. When I pressed her about where Dean was, she just said he was coming soon. 10 minutes later, Dean walked in like nothing had happened. Behind him was his mother, Joan. Now, Joan has always been a piece of work. She's one of those mothers who never cut the cord, always thought I wasn't good enough for her precious son, always trying to insert herself into the middle of our marriage. But seeing her there in that moment, when I was at my most vulnerable, made my stomach turn. Dean walked over and touched my hand like everything was perfectly normal. "You're okay," he said. "That's what matters." I pulled my hand away immediately. "Where's my baby? I want to see him right now." He looked at his mother, and she gave him this little nod. That's when Dean said something that still makes me furious: we had to make a safer plan. I asked him what the hell he was talking about, and that's when Joan stepped in with her poison. "We told the doctors about your history," she said in this fake sweet voice. "About the panic attacks, the depression after your miscarriage. You've been struggling, sweetie. You need rest." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Yes, I'd had some mental health struggles after losing my first pregnancy, but that didn't mean I couldn't see my own baby. "That doesn't mean I can't see my child," I said, but Joan just shook her head. "We weren't sure what state you'd be in. It was for his protection." My voice cracked when I asked, "Who gave you permission to make that decision?" That's when the nurse came back in with a clipboard. She handed me a copy of the consent form that had been signed during my surgery. My name was scrawled at the bottom, but I knew immediately it wasn't my signature. It was close, but it wasn't mine. I looked up at the nurse and asked, "Who signed this?" She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Your husband said it was approved." I turned to Dean and asked him directly, "Did you forge this, or did she?" He didn't answer. He just stood there like a coward while his mother smirked. Actually smirked. I felt a kind of rage I'd never experienced in my life. "I want to see my son right now," I said, but Joan shook her head again. When Dean told me I needed to calm down, that they said I wasn't stable, I lost it. I screamed from somewhere deep in my chest. I didn't care who heard me. Here's what they didn't understand about me: I might have been drugged, sliced open, and lied to, but I wasn't broken. They had just lit a fire that would burn their whole world down. That night, I didn't sleep. My body was in agony, but my mind was working overtime. I kept replaying everything: Joan walking in like she owned the place, Dean just standing there, that forged signature, that damn smirk. By morning, I had a plan. I demanded to see a patient advocate. When the nurse hesitated, I told her that if she didn't bring someone immediately, I would scream loud enough to bring the whole hospital down around us. 15 minutes later, a woman named Lori came into my room with a clipboard. I told her everything. I showed her the forged consent form, explained that Joan had signed my name without my knowledge or consent, and that my husband had gone along with it. I made it clear that no one had asked me anything about my baby's care, they had just moved him based on lies. Lori took detailed notes and asked smart questions. Then she said quietly, "I'll look into this immediately." I could tell she'd already heard whispers about what had happened. 2 hours later, a pediatric nurse came in with a wheelchair. "They've approved a visit," she said. As she wheeled me down that long hallway toward the NICU, I was preparing myself for battle. This was just the beginning. My son was in a clear bassinet, hooked up to monitors, tiny and read-faced and absolutely beautiful. I burst into tears the moment I saw him. When I reached for him, the nurse made me sanitize my hands first. I scrubbed like my life depended on it, then picked him up and held him close. "Mommy's here," I whispered. "I'm never letting anyone take you away from me again." When I got back to my room an hour later, Joan was sitting in the chair like she owned the place. "You weren't supposed to be there without supervision," she said, like I was some kind of criminal. "Get out," I told her, but she crossed her arms defiantly. "Dean is talking to a lawyer," she said. "If you want custody, we'll need to agree on terms." I actually laughed in her face. "You think I'm handing my son over to you, after what you just did?" "I didn't do anything illegal," she said smugly. "You were in a sound mind." The hospital agreed. When I accused her of forging my name, she said, "You'll never prove it." Then she left before I could respond. But here's what Joan didn't know about me. I'm not just emotional, I'm strategic. And I was about to prove just how smart I could be when everything was on the line. That night, Dean showed up alone. He looked tired but not sorry. "You're going to make this harder than it needs to be," he said. We were trying to protect him. When I asked him how keeping me from my son was protection, he just shrugged. "You're emotional. Look at yourself." That's when he dropped the real bomb. "Joan has filed for emergency guardianship. She's claiming you're unfit based on your history. The hospital gave her paperwork from your psychiatric hold last year." I was speechless. That hold had been for 20-4 hours after my miscarriage. I'd gone voluntarily to get help, and I'd never hurt anyone. "You gave her my medical records?" I asked. "I didn't stop her," he said. "They were concerned because you screamed at the nurses." Before he left, he told me he was staying with his mother and that I should focus on getting better. I was shaking with rage, but I was also thinking clearly for the first time since this nightmare began. I called my sister Maggie in Tempe. We hadn't been close in years, but I needed someone who wasn't trying to destroy me. I told her everything, and she said, "I'm driving up today. We're getting a lawyer." By the next day, Maggie was at my bedside with a folder full of lawyer names. "They think you're alone," she said, "but you're not." That afternoon, Lori came back with news that changed everything. "I reviewed all the documentation and the surveillance footage from the nurse's station," she said. "Your mother minus and minus laws on those forms. The nurse should have confirmed it with you directly. They didn't, and that's on us." She told me they'd suspended visitation access for both Dean and Joan, and that I now had full access to my baby. But the war was just beginning. Joan had filed for temporary custody, Dean had filed for separation, and 2 days after I was discharged, CPS showed up at my door. The CPS visit nearly broke me. I was sitting on my couch, still healing, cradling my baby Miles, when they knocked. Two women in their 40s, polite but firm, said they were following up on a report filed by a concerned relative. I didn't need to ask who. They looked around my apartment like they were searching for evidence of neglect. They asked about my sleep, my support systems, my mental health history. I was honest about everything: the breakdown after my miscarriage, the voluntary psychiatric hold, the help I'd gotten. But I could feel them evaluating whether I was a danger to my own child. After they left, I didn't just break down from fear. I broke down from pure rage. Every time I held Miles, I felt that fire in my chest growing stronger. I wasn't going to let that woman win. Maggie found me a lawyer in Prescott who specialized in family court and emergency custody cases. Jack Rosenthal had a reputation for being tough and smart. When he came to my apartment and reviewed the hospital documents, he immediately saw the leverage we had. "She forced your signature," he said. "They didn't follow protocol. That's our opening." But the real breakthrough came when Jack sent a subpoena to the hospital for all communications and security footage around my surgery. What we got back made my stomach turn, but it also gave me the ammunition I needed to destroy them both. The surveillance footage showed Joan at the nurse's station filling out paperwork, but then she made a phone call. Jack had the call traced to a private care facility in Cottonwood that specialized in maternal rehabilitation, and temporary guardianship placement. She was trying to have me committed to a mental health facility so she could take my son. Dean knew about it. He was copied on the email confirmation for my intake appointment. That's why they kept pushing the same narrative about me needing rest and help. They weren't trying to help me, they were trying to erase me. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. The hospital had filed an internal complaint against the nurse who let Joan sign the form. Feeling the heat, that nurse gave a sworn statement admitting that Joan had claimed to be my legal proxy with temporary medical decision minus making rights. It was a lie, but she said Dean had backed it up, claiming I'd signed the document weeks earlier. They had planned this weeks before I gave birth. They were never going to let me raise my son. But now I had proof, and I wasn't just fighting back anymore. I was about to bury them. The court date came fast. Jack pushed for an emergency hearing where we filed for full custody, protection orders, and a criminal investigation into the forged medical documents. I brought everything: the nurse's sworn statement, security footage, Joan's call logs, even the email confirmation from that rehabilitation center. Dean and Joan showed up dressed like they were going to church, trying to look respectable. But when the judge walked in and Jack started laying out the evidence, their facade crumbled fast. The courtroom was silent except for Joan's gasp when the audio recording of her calling the rehab center was played. "I told you not to keep those emails," Dean muttered under his breath. Everyone heard it, including the judge. Joan stood up crying, claiming she was just trying to help, but it was too late. When the judge asked if I had ever given her custody or medical authority, she had to admit I hadn't. When pressed about the forged signature, she could only say, "I thought she did." Dean's testimony was even worse. When the judge asked him to explain his actions, he said, "I thought if we handled it first, it would be easier later." The judge snapped. "You thought what, mister?" "Lyle?" Dean couldn't answer. Then Jack played our final card, a letter I had written to my OB 2 months earlier, specifically requesting that no medical decisions be approved by anyone other than me unless I was declared legally incompetent. I had made my wishes crystal clear in writing, but the hospital staff had missed it during the chaos. The judge ruled immediately full custody to me permanently. Restraining orders against Joan and Dean for 5 years. The hospital was found partially liable for negligence and forced to pay a settlement. Joan was charged with fraud and forgery, Dean with conspiracy to commit medical fraud. But I still wasn't finished with them. Joan lost everything. She'd already drained part of her retirement to help Dean with legal fees, and once the charges hit, she had to put her house up for sale. Dean moved back in with her to broken people under one crumbling roof. Here's where my real intelligence came into play. I had taken screenshots of texts from Dean over the years, moments where he joked about how crazy Joan was and how he wished he could get her to back off. I sent those texts to his 2 sisters, who had always hated Joan but stayed quiet out of family loyalty. That silence broke fast. They showed up at court during the fraud hearings, not to support Dean, but to testify against Joan. One of them even said she'd seen Joan practicing my signature years ago, that she'd always known something was off about her. Joan pled out to avoid jail time. She got 2 years probation and a fine she couldn't afford. She had to sell the house where she'd raised Dean, the same house where she told me I'd never be strong enough to be a mother. Now she rents a studio apartment behind a strip mall. Dean lost his real estate license and his job. Turns out getting charged with fraud while working in real estate isn't great for business. His license was suspended pending further review. As for me, I kept building my life. I went to therapy, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to make sure I never let anyone silence me again. I started sharing my story with women's groups and met other mothers who'd been through similar experiences of gaslighting, manipulation, and postpartum abuse. We built something strong together. Miles turned 1 last month. He's walking now, smiling, calling me mama, and clinging to me like I'm his whole world. I still have nightmares sometimes about waking up in that hospital bed not knowing where he was. But now I wake up to him giggling and climbing over my legs, tugging at my shirt. He's safe, I'm safe, and Dean. Last I heard, he tried to move to Texas for a fresh start, but his fraud charges followed him. Joan tried to petition the court last month to have the restraining order removed. It was denied. The judge said, and I quote, "Your actions placed a newborn child and his mother in a dangerous and traumatic situation. You are lucky you are not in prison." You want to know the best part? Neither of them ever apologized. Not once. But that's okay, because I didn't need their apology. I got something much better. I got my son. I got justice, and I got the last word. The fire they lit in me that day didn't destroy me. It forged me into someone stronger, smarter, and more determined than they ever imagined I could be. And every time I look at Miles, I'm reminded that sometimes the most important battles are the ones where you're fighting for love.